A Detroit factory worker with a dream to uplift his community encounters a mysterious businessman on a fateful flight. Amid a raging storm, racial prejudice, and an impossible challenge, he gets a once-in-a-lifetime chance to make a difference. Witness the gripping journey of Ezra Langston and his pursuit to transform lives. Detroit was swallowed by the bitter cold. Snow blanketed the cobblestone streets, and icy winds slashed through the neighborhoods like invisible blades. The once bustling industrial city now lay heavy and desolate, mirroring the burdened faces of the people trudging through the frost, heads bowed, bracing against the cutting gusts. Ezra Langston pulled his worn, tattered coat tighter around himself. The coat, which had seen too many winters, no longer provided the warmth it once did. His work boots, scuffed and stained with oil, were worn down from years of grueling labor. Snow clung to the frayed hem of his pants as his heavy steps left deep prints in the thick, icy ground. Ezra's face bore the lines of exhaustion and worry, etched deep by years of struggle. Yet, in his eyes, a faint glimmer of hope still flickered, a fragile ember refusing to be extinguished. "I can't let Selena carry this alone," he thought, a fleeting image of his wife, lying in a hospital bed flashing through his mind. Selena, strong, steadfast Selena, the woman who had always believed in Ezra, even when life seemed determined to crush them both. But now, cancer was draining the life from her, taking her strength day by day. Ezra clenched his rough, calloused hands into fists. "I have to do something. I need to find a better job. I'll get her through this. Whatever it takes." Snow swirled chaotically in the wind, settling on the streaks of gray in Ezra's hair. He didn't bother brushing it off. His thoughts were consumed by a single focus, the plane ticket in his pocket. That ticket was everything he had managed to scrape together. A cheap flight to New York, where he hoped to find a better job and a chance to turn their lives around. Quickening his pace, Ezra's battered boots crunched through the fresh snow as he made his way to the Detroit Metropolitan Airport. The airport was bustling yet cold, both in temperature and atmosphere. Overhead announcements droned, listing departing flights. Passengers pulled sleek luggage through security lines, lost in their schedules and plans. Ezra stepped into the waiting area, feeling out of place amidst the well-dressed crowd. He dragged his small, battered suitcase behind him, his eyes scanning for his gate. The crumpled ticket in his hand bore the imprint of his resolve. "This flight, this is the start of something new," he told himself, his heart a mixture of hope and apprehension. In the corner of the lounge, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit tapped away at his phone. This was Oliver Trent, the CEO of a major financial firm in New York. His polished leather shoes gleamed under the airport lights, and his designer luggage sat neatly beside him. Oliver glanced up as Ezra approached the waiting area. The sight of Ezra's shabby appearance made him scowl. "Excuse me," Ezra asked gently. "Is this seat taken?" Oliver shook his head but said nothing. Instead, he pulled out a tissue and meticulously wiped the chair before sitting down himself, as if the mere act of touching it might soil his pristine attire. Ezra sat quietly beside him, unfazed. Oliver cast a sideways glance at Ezra, his gaze filled with disdain. He muttered just loud enough for Ezra to hear. "These days, anyone can afford a plane ticket, huh?" Ezra heard every word, but he didn't respond. His hands tightened around the ticket in his lap, but he remained calm. He was used to looks like that, to the judgment from those who believed he didn't belong. Today, though, he refused to let it bother him. He had bigger things to focus on. "Don't let them get to you," he reminded himself. "You're here for Selena, for her future, and for yours." Across the room, Another man quietly observed the interaction. Nathaniel Brooks sat motionless, his sharp, contemplative eyes fixed on Ezra. In his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and an air of quiet authority, Nathaniel exuded an enigmatic presence. His dark suit was immaculate, and a small leather briefcase rested neatly by his feet. But unlike Oliver, Nathaniel's gaze carried no judgment, only curiosity. There was something about this weathered worker that caught his attention. Nathaniel leaned back slightly, his voice a low murmur to himself. The world often underestimates those with the greatest potential. Unbeknownst to Ezra, his life was about to change forever, starting with this very moment. As Ezra sat silently in the waiting area, his hands clutching the crumpled ticket, another man quietly entered the first-class lounge. No one paid attention to his arrival, but anyone who happened to glance his way would find it hard to look away. Nathaniel Brooks carried an unmistakable air of distinction. Dressed in a finely tailored black suit, his tall, upright figure exuded an understated power. A crisp white shirt peeked out from beneath a silver-gray tie, and in his hand was a dark brown leather briefcase, one that seemed to radiate both mystery and significance. But it wasn't Nathaniel's clothing or posture that drew notice. It was his eyes. Sharp yet contemplative, his gaze was unlike that of other businessmen, who were often absorbed in their phones or paperwork. Nathaniel observed the room with a quiet intensity, as though searching for something beyond the reach of wealth or status. He paid little mind to the hurried passengers around him. Moving slowly, his eyes scanned each face in the waiting area, none holding his attention for long, until they landed on Ezra Langston. Nathaniel stopped in his tracks, his gaze locking onto the weary laborer sitting at the far end of the row. Ezra didn't notice he was being watched. He stared down at the ticket in his hands, his face etched with worry. Nathaniel's eyes softened, a flicker of thought crossing his mind. A man like him, sitting here, amidst the cold stares and silent judgment. This world is cruel to those who don't fit the mold. He stepped toward the nearby coffee counter, ordered an espresso, and stood waiting, his attention still fixed on Ezra. With the steaming cup in hand, Nathaniel moved slowly back toward the seating area. Ezra remained where he was, gripping the ticket tightly, his gaze distant. Nathaniel approached, his curiosity growing. But it wasn't the cold, detached curiosity of the privileged. It was the kind of interest born from someone who had once been searching for something, or someone, just like this. A man like him. He might be the answer I've been looking for. Nathaniel paused a few feet away, a faint, unreadable smile forming on his lips. He didn't yet know why Ezra was here, nor where this man's journey might lead. But something about him, his worn demeanor, his quiet resolve, stirred a distant memory within Nathaniel. He saw in Ezra a reflection of his own younger self, a man battered by the world yet holding on to a fragile glimmer of hope. Nathaniel decided to wait. The announcement crackled over the speakers. Passengers on flight AA1701 to New York, please proceed to Gate 5. Ezra rose, pulling his small, scuffed suitcase behind him. His steps were hesitant but determined, and for the first time, he didn't lower his gaze to the ground. From across the room, Nathaniel watched with quiet intrigue. His eyes gleamed with something more than mere interest, anticipation. This flight, it could be the beginning of a different story. With his espresso in hand, Nathaniel followed Ezra at a measured pace, heading toward the gate. This meeting, though Ezra was still unaware of it, would alter the course of his life forever. The American Airlines flight began boarding. Ezra Langston pulled his small, battered suitcase through the gate, his hands trembling slightly from the lingering chill in the air. As he entered the economy cabin, he quickly found his seat, 24B, right by the aisle. Carefully, he lifted his suitcase into the overhead compartment before settling into his seat. The seat was stiff and cramped, but Ezra didn't complain. Just being on this flight felt like a small victory. Leaning back, he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady the storm of nerves churning inside him. When he opened his eyes, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit entered the cabin. It was Oliver Trent, the CEO of a major financial firm in New York. Oliver made his way to 24C, the seat next to Ezra. The moment he spotted the black man in worn work clothes sitting beside it, his face twisted into a scowl of disapproval. Oliver didn't bother to hide his discomfort. Turning sharply toward the nearest flight attendant, he spoke in a curt, clipped tone. "Excuse me, is there any way I can change my seat? I'm not comfortable sitting next to someone like this." His voice carried through the quiet cabin, drawing a few glances from other passengers. They quickly looked away, unwilling to involve themselves in the tension brewing nearby. Ezra lowered his head, gripping the armrests tightly. It wasn't the first time he'd heard words like this. He'd endured them his entire life, from demanding bosses, condescending co-workers, and even strangers on the street. But no matter how many times he heard them, they still cut as deeply as the first. Taking a slow breath, Ezra fought to keep his composure. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he thought to himself. "I'm here for an opportunity." Oliver cast a disdainful glance at Ezra, his voice dripping with mockery. "What do you do for a living? A laborer? Lucky you could afford a plane ticket. Discount fare, I assume?" Ezra didn't reply. He kept his gaze fixed on the window, watching the late afternoon sky turn shades of gray. Oliver scoffed, pulling out his laptop from his sleek carry-on and flipping open the screen. Muttering just loud enough for Ezra to hear, he said, "Seems like anyone can get on a plane these days, no matter who they are." Ezra closed his eyes, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A few rows ahead, Nathaniel Brooks observed the scene with quiet intensity. Sitting upright with his hands clasped, Nathaniel's sharp, discerning eyes betrayed no outward emotion. He had witnessed acts of discrimination like this too many times before. But what drew his attention now wasn't Oliver Trent's behavior. It was Ezra Langston's response. Nathaniel sipped his coffee from a small cup handed to him by the flight attendant moments earlier. His gaze remained fixed on Ezra, studying the man who was clearly restraining himself from reacting to the blatant insult. He noted the way Ezra sat upright, the way he seemed to channel his anger inward, holding onto his dignity despite the humiliation. Speaking softly, almost to himself, Nathaniel murmured, "The world so often underestimates those with the greatest potential." The American Airlines flight AA-1701 soared through the gray skies, its wings cutting through thick clouds that obscured the view outside, blanketing the world in a haze of pale white. Ezra Langston sat quietly by the window, his gaze fixed on the indistinct horizon. He had grown accustomed to seeing the world through a blurred lens. His life had never been painted in vibrant colors. A voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are entering an area of turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated." As the announcement ended, the plane began to tremble. Ezra gripped the armrests tightly. The turbulence intensified, and the aircraft jolted sharply, its cabin lights flickering like an old bulb on the brink of failure. The engines roared, their growl reverberating through the cabin, amplifying the tension that hung heavy in the air. Ezra took a deep breath, sweat forming on his brow, but his eyes remained steady. He had weathered far worse storms in his life: job losses, crushing debt, his wife's illness. He knew well the feeling of being powerless against forces beyond his control, And now, amidst the chaos of the plane's turbulence, Ezra found a strange clarity. This storm is just another challenge, he thought. I've survived worse than this. Not everyone shared Ezra's calm resolve. Ahead of him, a woman gasped for air, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles turned white. Some passengers murmured prayers, while others clung to an air of composure that their terrified eyes betrayed. Beside Ezra, Oliver Trent scowled out the window. Every jolt of the plane seemed to fray his patience further. Tugging sharply at his seatbelt, he muttered under his breath, "This is completely irresponsible, flying into a storm like this." Turning toward Ezra, Oliver's disdainful gaze hardened. "Aren't you scared?" he sneered. "People like you probably aren't used to being on planes, huh?" Ezra didn't respond. He stared straight ahead, as though Oliver's words had failed to reach him. But inside, the bitterness swelled. "I've heard this all my life," Ezra thought, his grip tightening on the armrest. "But none of them know what I've had to endure." In the row ahead, Nathaniel Brooks watched the exchange with his usual composed demeanor. Sitting upright, his hands folded neatly, Nathaniel's sharp eyes missed nothing. Discrimination was nothing new to him, but it wasn't Oliver's arrogance that captured his attention. It was Ezra's restraint. As Nathaniel sipped his espresso, his gaze lingered on the laborer who refused to let his pride falter under the weight of another man's scorn. The patience he holds, the dignity he protects. Nathaniel thought. The world so often misjudges those with the greatest strength. The plane shuddered again, a flash of lightning illuminating the gray void outside. The captain's voice returned, more urgent this time. "Due to severe weather conditions, we will be making an emergency landing at Ohio Airport. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Ezra glanced at Oliver, noting how the man's face had grown pale. The smugness had vanished, replaced by a look of genuine fear. The aircraft began its descent, engines roaring louder as it pushed through the thick clouds. With a sudden jolt, the wheels touched down on a snow-covered runway. The impact threw passengers forward in their seats, but the plane slowed to a halt. Outside the window, the storm raged on, snow swirling violently in the wind. The intercom crackled to life again. "We have safely landed at Ohio Airport. Please remain seated and await further instructions from the crew." Ezra exhaled a long, steady breath, his eyes drawn to the storm outside. Beside him, Oliver fumbled with his seatbelt, muttering as he stood to retrieve his luggage. "What a miserable flight. Why do I have to endure this nonsense?" Ezra remained silent, rising slowly to join the stream of passengers disembarking the plane. Nathaniel, as always, watched quietly. As he stepped off the plane, Nathaniel paused under the stormy sky. The wind whipped around him, carrying the sound of the tempest like a relentless reminder of life's unpredictability. A faint, enigmatic smile crossed his lips. "This storm, it's just the beginning." He adjusted the leather briefcase in his hand, his steps deliberate and steady as he followed Ezra and Oliver into the waiting lounge. The airport announcements droned on, a constant rhythm in the background. But this time, the lives that had just weathered the storm were unknowingly veering onto a new path, one where mysterious plans were about to unfold. The waiting lounge at Ohio Airport remained eerily quiet, interrupted only by the steady drone of announcements relaying delayed flights due to the relentless storm. Outside the large windows, the blizzard raged on. Snow blanketed the ground in an endless sheet of white, and icy winds whipped across the parked planes on the tarmac, leaving long, jagged streaks in the snow. Ezra Langston sat in a corner of the lounge, his head bowed, hands clasped tightly together as though trying to find warmth. His mind churned with a storm of its own. Selena's mounting medical bills, an uncertain future, and the sting of Oliver Trent's earlier words. In the distance, Nathaniel Brooks stood silently, his sharp eyes fixed on Ezra as though deliberating something. After a moment, he began walking toward the worker, his steps measured, his demeanor calm and confident. Reaching the seat next to Ezra, Nathaniel sat down, placing his well-worn leather briefcase neatly on his lap. He tilted his head slightly and offered a faint, knowing smile. "You seem like a patient man." Ezra looked up, surprised by the unexpected comment. He wasn't used to strangers striking up conversations with him, especially not someone who carried the air of authority and refinement that Nathaniel exuded. "I've been watching you since we boarded the plane," Nathaniel continued, his voice low and steady. "Not many people keep their composure like you did during that turbulence." Ezra shrugged. "I'm used to it. My life's been nothing but storms, one after another." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze sharp yet understanding. "What keeps you standing through all of them?" The question made Ezra pause. No one had ever asked him that before. Yet something about Nathaniel, the calmness in his tone, the way his eyes seemed to truly listen, made Ezra feel compelled to answer. "I've worked in factories for 12 years, Ezra began, his voice heavy, as though recounting someone else's story. "Every day, I stood in the deafening roar of machines, wondering if there was any way out." Nathaniel said nothing, his silence urging Ezra to continue. "But every day, I'd think about the kids in my neighborhood, the ones I grew up with," Ezra said, his gaze drifting as though seeing a memory play out. "They never had a chance. Trapped in a cycle of poverty, violence, and prejudice." Nathaniel leaned forward slightly. "And what do you want to do for them?" Ezra straightened, his hands tightening into fists. "I want to build a place where those kids can learn. A place where they can stay away from gangs and drugs. A nonprofit that gives them opportunities." His voice gained strength as he spoke, the words carrying the weight of years of unspoken dreams. "I don't want our children to grow up in a world where they don't have a chance." Nathaniel leaned back in his seat, his expression contemplative. He nodded slowly, as though Ezra's words had affirmed something in his mind. "Do you know why I'm sitting here talking to you?" Nathaniel asked. Ezra frowned, his confusion evident. "I'm looking for someone worthy of an investment." Ezra blinked, his brow furrowing. "Why me? I'm nothing special." Nathaniel's smile returned, gentle yet enigmatic. "That's true. On the surface, you don't look like an investor or an entrepreneur. But you have something I'm searching for." Ezra stayed silent, waiting for him to explain. Nathaniel leaned forward, his tone serious but not unkind. "You have a dream. And more importantly, you have the courage to hold on to it, no matter how many storms life throws your way." The words sank into Ezra's mind, deeper than he expected. He never imagined a man like Nathaniel would see value in someone like him. Nathaniel rose from his seat, straightening his suit jacket before turning back to Ezra. "The storm outside isn't as dangerous as the ones we carry inside us. If you can weather those, you can change your life and the lives of many others." With that, Nathaniel walked away, his steps steady and deliberate, leaving Ezra to sit in stunned silence, his thoughts swirling like the storm outside. He didn't know where this encounter would lead him, but something within him had shifted. A small flame had been lit, a spark of hope. And Ezra knew that this journey was the beginning of something far greater than he had ever imagined. Outside the waiting lounge window, the storm continued its relentless assault on the bleak sky. Inside, Ezra Langston sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly as if holding onto the fragments of warmth and hope that still lingered. His contemplative gaze followed the hurried footsteps of passengers moving past him. Not far away, Nathaniel Brooks stood with his usual calm demeanor, though his sharp eyes betrayed an internal deliberation. After a moment, he turned and walked purposefully toward Ezra. "You want to change your world, don't you?" Nathaniel asked as he stopped near Ezra. Ezra looked up, startled by the directness of the question. He nodded softly. "I want to change my community," he replied, his voice heavy with quiet determination. "But to do that, I need an opportunity." Nathaniel sat down across from Ezra, placing his leather briefcase on the small table between them. His expression grew more serious, his voice steady but intent. "I can give you that opportunity," Nathaniel said slowly. "But first, I need to see if you can make a real difference." Ezra frowned, uncertainty clouding his features. "What do you mean?" Leaning back in his chair, Nathaniel clasped his hands together, his tone unwavering. "If you can convince Oliver Trent, a man deeply entrenched in his prejudices, to change his perspective, I will consider investing in your dream." Ezra straightened in his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be serious," he said, shaking his head. "Oliver Trent is a racist. He's looked at me with disdain since the moment we got on that plane. You think I can change his mind?" Nathaniel's expression didn't falter, his calm demeanor unwavering in the face of Ezra's doubt. "What seems impossible," Nathaniel said, his voice warm yet firm, "is often the very thing most worth trying." Ezra fell silent, his brow furrowed deeply. The weight of the challenge Nathaniel had set before him pressed heavily on his shoulders. "Oliver Trent isn't the kind of man who listens to reason," Ezra said after a long pause. "He lives in his own world, a world of money, power, and prejudice." Nathaniel nodded thoughtfully. "Exactly. And that's why this challenge matters. Sometimes, to change the world, we have to start with the people we think are beyond change." Nathaniel leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You think your dream is just to help the children in your neighborhood? No. If you want to create real change, you have to learn how to engage even with people like Oliver Trent." Ezra met Nathaniel's eyes, searching for a hint of mockery or condescension, but found only sincerity. "You can walk away now," Nathaniel said, his tone soft but resolute. "Like you've done so many times before. Or you can try and make a real difference." The words struck Ezra deeply, reverberating in his mind like a bell tolling in the quiet. He lowered his head, his hands tightening as memories washed over him. The factory floors where he had spent countless hours. The sleepless nights at Selena's bedside. The faces of the children from his neighborhood, once full of dreams to become doctors and engineers, now trapped in cycles of poverty and violence. "If I walk away now, I'll always be part of that same cycle." Slowly, Ezra raised his head, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I can walk away," he thought to himself, "like I've done before. Or I can try and make a real difference." Ezra stood, his hands trembling slightly, but the spark of hope and resolve in his gaze burned steadily. Nathaniel observed him closely, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Have you made your decision?" Nathaniel asked. Ezra nodded. "I don't know if I can change Oliver Trent's mind," he admitted. "But I know this is a chance I can't afford to waste." Nathaniel rose to his feet, placing a firm but reassuring hand on Ezra's shoulder. Sometimes, the right conversation at the right moment is all it takes to change a life. Ezra drew in a deep breath, his fists clenching at his sides. He didn't know what lay ahead, but this time, he wouldn't give up. And so began Ezra's journey, from a factory worker burdened by the weight of life storms to a leader determined to transform his community. It all started with this challenge. The American Airlines flight AA-1701 resumed its journey after the unexpected layover at Ohio Airport. Passengers believed the worst of the storm was behind them, anticipating nothing but a peaceful flight to New York. But fate had other plans. Ezra Langston sat in a middle-row seat, his hands clasped tightly together. Nathaniel Brooks' words echoed in his mind. "I can walk away, or I can try." Suddenly, a deafening sound tore through the air outside the plane. Bang! The plane jolted violently. Overhead compartments burst open, and luggage tumbled down, scattering across the aisle. Panicked screams filled the cabin. Ezra's head shot up, his eyes darting toward the window. Through the thick, frosted glass, he saw something that made his heart seize. Thick black smoke billowed from the right engine. Another explosion, smaller but just as ominous, rocked the aircraft. Flickering flames licked at the edges of the engine, their glow cutting through the dense smoke as shards of metal spiraled into the turbulent skies. "Oh God," Ezra whispered, his heart pounding against his chest. The plane bucked and swayed more violently. Cabin lights flickered, dimmed, and then went out entirely. Screams and cries erupted all around him. A woman near the aisle clutched her child tightly, tears streaming down her face as she tried to shield them both. Further up, a middle-aged man buried his face in his hands, mumbling prayers under his breath. Next to Ezra, Oliver Trent was pale as a sheet, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he fumbled with his seatbelt. The confident, smug air that typically surrounded him had evaporated, replaced by the raw, primal terror of someone staring death in the face. Ezra glanced around the cabin. Frantic eyes darted in every direction, cries mingling with desperate prayers, creating an oppressive atmosphere of panic and despair. "Are we going to crash?" A trembling voice whispered from a few rows behind. The PA system crackled to life, and the captain's voice broke through, this time laced with tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a critical failure in the right engine. We are doing everything we can to stabilize the situation. Please remain seated, fasten your seatbelts, and stay calm." Moments later, the head flight attendant's voice followed, though the reassurance in her tone felt thin. "Please remain calm and follow the crew's instructions. We will guide you through emergency procedures as necessary." But the words did little to quell the storm of fear that engulfed the cabin. Ezra gripped the armrests tightly, forcing himself to stay calm. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his gaze remained focused and steady. "I've survived worse storms than this," he reminded himself. "I'll get through this too." Yet, as he turned to Oliver, Ezra saw a man unraveling. Oliver's hands shook so violently he couldn't tighten his seatbelt. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, his wide eyes darting around in unspoken panic. Reaching over, Ezra placed a firm, steady hand on Oliver's shoulder. "Fasten your seatbelt," Ezra said, his voice low and calm. "We're going to be okay." Oliver looked up, his bloodshot eyes meeting Ezra's. For a moment, he seemed too paralyzed to respond. But then, as if some part of him latched onto Ezra's composure, he nodded shakily and obeyed. Another massive explosion reverberated through the cabin. Bang! The plane tilted sharply to one side, sending passengers lurching against their seatbelts. More cries pierced the air as black smoke seeped into the cabin, thickening the already suffocating atmosphere. The PA crackled once more. "We will be making an emergency landing." Please remain seated and follow the crew's instructions." Ezra closed his eyes, drawing in a deep, measured breath. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw Selena's face, her tired but resolute smile, the way her hand felt in his during the long nights by her hospital bed. "Selena, I'm coming back." When he opened his eyes, they burned with determination. "I will survive this storm." The plane barreled through the dense, gray clouds, plummeting toward the ground below. Inside, 100 hearts beat wildly, each life hanging on the precipice of fate. The plane lurched violently, its cabin lights flickering erratically as the engines roared and wind howled outside. Passengers clutched their seatbelts tightly, but terror was etched into their faces. Suddenly, Oliver Trent's panicked scream shattered the already tense atmosphere. "I can't die here. I demand a spot on the lifeboat." Like a wild animal driven by fear, Oliver sprang from his seat, bolting toward the front of the cabin, clawing at nearby seats in a desperate bid to claim a non-existent lifeboat. "Move," he shouted at a flight attendant, his voice cracking with desperation. "I deserve to survive." Sweat poured down his pale face, his once composed demeanor unraveling entirely. The CEO, who always exuded an air of superiority, now appeared nothing more than a man consumed by primal terror, clinging to even the faintest hope of survival. Other passengers began to shrink back, their own fear ignited by Oliver's hysteria. Like a spark in dry grass, his panic spread rapidly. "Oh God," a woman whispered, clutching her child tightly as tears streamed down her face. Chaos erupted. Screams, sobs, and frantic prayers filled the air as several passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, scrambling to flee despite having nowhere to go. "We're going down," a man's voice rang out, cracking under the weight of dread. Through the pandemonium, Nathaniel Brooks remained seated in the first row, his sharp eyes observing everything with a calm, calculating gaze. He saw Oliver's loss of control. He saw the fear swallowing the crowd. But most importantly, he saw Ezra Langston. Ezra sat firmly in his seat, gripping the armrests tightly. His knuckles were white, his face glistening with sweat, but his eyes betrayed no panic. Nathaniel tilted his head ever so slightly, signaling to Ezra. "This is your moment," Nathaniel seemed to say. Ezra looked back at him, their eyes locking. In that instant, something clicked inside Ezra, a spark of resolve. Taking a deep breath, Ezra rose from his seat. He stepped into the aisle, raising his hands to command attention. The cacophony began to fade as passengers noticed him. The screams softened to murmurs. Ezra's voice, steady and firm, cut through the tension. "Listen to me. We won't survive this if we don't work together." He scanned the cabin, meeting the terrified eyes of those around him. "No one here is more important than anyone else," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "No one has a greater right to live than anyone else." Oliver froze mid-panic, his breath hitching as Ezra approached. The sheer confidence in Ezra's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Skin color doesn't matter," Ezra continued, his words clear and deliberate. "Not when we're all sitting on the same plane." His declaration hung in the air, cutting through the lingering chaos like a knife. "The only way we get through this," Ezra said, his voice rising, "is if we stay calm and act as one." A hush fell over the cabin. Ezra's words seemed to breathe life into a room suffocated by fear. Passengers slowly sat back in their seats, tightening their seatbelts. The woman with the crying child looked at Ezra, her tears slowing as a faint glimmer of hope filled her eyes. A young man sitting near the window broke the silence, his voice trembling but earnest. "We're going to make it, aren't we?" Ezra nodded firmly. We will, but only if we work together. He turned to Oliver, who stood rooted to the spot, his face a mix of embarrassment and fear. Sit down, Mr. Trent, Ezra said, his tone unyielding. We need you to sit down and stay calm. Oliver opened his mouth as if to argue but found no words. He lowered his gaze, his cheeks flushed with shame, and shuffled back to his seat. The man who had once belittled Ezra now obeyed him without question. Nathaniel observed it all, his expression unreadable, though a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Ezra Langston had done the impossible. He had not only quelled the chaos but had taken the reins of leadership in a moment of absolute despair. Nathaniel murmured softly to himself, almost in awe. Sometimes, to change the world, we must start with the people we least expect. Ezra turned, his gaze briefly meeting Nathaniel's. In that fleeting moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. And as the plane plunged through stormy skies toward an uncertain landing, both men knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The AA-1701 flight steadied once more. The screams and sobbing had faded, leaving behind an uneasy silence. Passengers clung to their armrests, but the suffocating tension that had gripped the cabin moments ago had begun to lift. Ezra Langston stood in the aisle, his gaze firm and unwavering. He scanned the faces of those around him, people who had just stared death in the face, and felt the subtle shift in their expressions. Fear had given way to something softer, something resolute. From the front of the cabin, Nathaniel Brooks rose slowly. With his leather briefcase still in hand, he strode toward Ezra, his movements calm, his eyes filled with quiet contemplation. You did well, Ezra, Nathaniel said, his voice low but weighted with meaning. Very well. Ezra gave a slight nod, though questions swirled in his mind. Why are you doing this? Ezra asked. Why do you care about me, a complete stranger? Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He paused, as though carefully choosing his words, then motioned toward an empty row of seats. He placed his briefcase on the table between them and gestured for Ezra to sit. Take a seat. I'll tell you a story. Nathaniel's gaze drifted to the window, where the sky outside remained shrouded in gray. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years gone by. I wasn't born into wealth, Nathaniel began. I grew up in a poor neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. Every day was a fight for survival. Ezra listened intently, curiosity flickering in his eyes. My father was white, Nathaniel continued, but my mother was black. Back then, neither community accepted us. We were isolated, living under the crushing weight of poverty and prejudice. Nathaniel inhaled deeply, his voice dropping as he recounted his past. There were days when I had nothing to eat. I thought I'd be trapped forever in that endless cycle, poverty, despair, and a complete lack of opportunity. Ezra's expression softened, a wave of empathy washing over him. But then, Nathaniel said, his voice tinged with a faint warmth, I met someone. He paused, as though savoring a memory long buried but never forgotten. The man who gave me my first chance was a black man. Ezra blinked in surprise, his posture straightening as intrigue swept over him. Who was he? Ezra asked. Nathaniel's lips curved into a small, wistful smile. He owned a tiny store in my neighborhood. He saw something in me no one else did, potential. He gave me my first job, taught me how to manage, and, most importantly, he taught me that a person's worth isn't defined by their skin color or where they come from. Nathaniel turned to Ezra, his gaze piercing yet kind. "He changed my life. And from that day forward, I swore that if I ever had the chance, I would pay it forward by giving others the opportunities they deserve." Nathaniel leaned closer, his eyes locking with Ezra's. "Ezra, you have the qualities of a leader, a person who can guide your community through adversity." Ezra lowered his head, his hands clasped tightly together. Nathaniel's words sent his heart racing. "You did something remarkable," Nathaniel continued. "You calmed a crowd on the brink of chaos. You made them listen. That's not an easy thing to do." Ezra lifted his head, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "But I'm just a factory worker," he said. "I'm not a leader." Nathaniel shook his head firmly. "Leadership isn't about holding the highest position or having the most money. It's about seeing beyond yourself and putting the needs of others above your own." He let the words hang in the air before adding, "You have the power to create real change, Ezra, and I believe your community needs someone like you." Ezra sat in silence, the weight of Nathaniel's faith in him settling heavily on his shoulders. His heart swelled with a mix of hope, gratitude, and trepidation. "I've been waiting for an opportunity like this my entire life," Ezra thought. "But now I see it's not just for me. It's for everyone counting on me." Drawing in a deep breath, Ezra straightened his back, resolve hardening in his eyes. "Thank you," Ezra said, his voice steadier now. "I won't waste this opportunity." Outside the window, the storm clouds began to part. The first rays of dawn pierced through, painting the sky with a soft golden hue. The turbulence of the past hours seemed to dissipate with the arrival of light. In the cabin, the passengers had settled back into their seats. The chaos had given way to a quiet introspection, each person lost in their own thoughts. Oliver Trent rose hesitantly, his steps slow and deliberate as he approached Ezra. To Ezra's surprise, Oliver extended a hand. I owe you an apology," Oliver said quietly, his voice stripped of arrogance. "Thank you for what you did." Ezra regarded Oliver's outstretched hand for a moment before clasping it firmly. "We only survive when we work together," Ezra said, his voice calm yet resolute. "I think you've come to understand that." Oliver nodded, genuine regret glimmering in his eyes. As the plane resumed its journey to New York, it carried more than just passengers. It bore individuals transformed by what they had endured together. And in Ezra's heart, he knew this was just the beginning of something far greater. Outside the window, the first rays of dawn began piercing through the thick clouds, chasing away the darkness and lingering fear within the hearts of the passengers. The AA-1701 descended slowly, the gray skies giving way to the gentle light of a new morning. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing to land at New York International Airport. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated until the aircraft comes to a complete stop." The plane glided smoothly onto the runway, leaving long tracks on the dew-soaked ground. The sun rose over the horizon, its golden orange light streaming through the windows, bringing a sense of safety and hope to everyone on board the fateful flight. Inside the cabin, the roar of the engine softened. A collective sigh of relief spread among the passengers. Some bowed their heads in prayer, their lips moving in silent gratitude. Others wept openly, gripping the hands of those beside them as if to affirm their survival. A single clap echoed from the front row, quickly followed by more until the entire cabin erupted in applause. "Thank you, crew," an elderly passenger called out. "Thank God." The applause mingled with relieved smiles, dissolving the last remnants of tension from the chaos that had gripped them just hours earlier. Ezra Langston remained seated, his gaze fixed on the light streaming through the window. As the warm glow of morning touched his face, a profound sense of relief and gratitude welled up within him. Ezra, thinking, I've survived the storm, but this journey isn't over yet. As the plane came to a full stop, passengers rose one by one, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Amid the bustling crowd, Oliver Trent remained seated, his eyes fixed intently on Ezra. Gone was the arrogance and self-assured demeanor he had worn like armor. In its place was a look of contemplation and remorse. Slowly, Oliver stood, his steps toward Ezra carrying the weight of embarrassment and regret. Ezra glanced up, noticing Oliver approaching. He raised an eyebrow, bracing for something unexpected. Oliver stopped in front of him. Oliver, voice low, sincere, I was wrong. Ezra met his gaze, his expression calm but understanding. Oliver, I want to apologize for what I said and how I acted. I let my prejudices blind me. But today, you showed me something I never thought possible. Oliver lowered his head, his shoulders trembling as though bearing an immense burden. You didn't just save this flight, you saved me. Ezra studied him for a long moment before nodding gently. Ezra, we can all change if we truly want to. Oliver lifted his head, his eyes carrying a new light, gratitude, respect, and perhaps even hope. He extended a hand toward Ezra. Ezra looked at that hand, the same hand that had clutched a life jacket in selfish desperation not long ago. But now, it was a hand reaching out in reconciliation. Ezra stood, clasping Oliver's hand firmly. The handshake between them, two men once divided by prejudice, became a symbol of reconciliation and a fresh start. The two men locked eyes, the divide of race and status now replaced by mutual understanding and respect. Nearby passengers, witnessing the moment, nodded quietly to themselves. Nathaniel Brooks, standing at a distance, smiled faintly. He knew he had been right to place his faith in Ezra Langston. Nathaniel stepped closer to Ezra and Oliver. Nathaniel, calmly, how does it feel? Ezra released Oliver's hand, turning to Nathaniel, his eyes burning with determination. Ezra, it feels like I've finally found the path I'm meant to take. Nathaniel nodded. Then walk it. Ezra glanced out the window. The golden light of dawn continued to spread, illuminating the long runway ahead. Ezra, voice steady. This is the beginning, he said. Not just for me, but for my community as well. The atmosphere in the airplane cabin had calmed, a stark contrast to the chaos from moments ago. Passengers sat quietly, reflecting on the fragility of life and the profound lessons they had just witnessed. Nathaniel Brooks rose from his seat, smoothing his suit jacket. He walked slowly to the center of the cabin, his movements deliberate, ensuring everyone could hear his words. Morning light filtered through the windows, casting a gentle glow on Nathaniel's composed face. His eyes, serene yet piercing, carried the weight of a man who had endured countless storms and emerged with a clarity born of experience. Nathaniel's gaze swept across the cabin before settling on Ezra Langston, the man who had risen during the darkest moment to guide others through their fear. A faint smile touched Nathaniel's lips, filled with pride. Nathaniel stepped forward, his eyes calm yet sharp, like those of a seasoned soul. He looked at Ezra with a quiet pride, as though he had finally found what he'd been searching for all along. Taking a deep breath, Nathaniel began, his voice clear and commanding. Ezra Langston. The cabin fell silent. Every eye turned toward Nathaniel and Ezra. I have been searching for someone like you for years, Someone who not only dreams but dares to stand up and make that dream a reality. Ezra sat frozen in his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. Nathaniel's voice deepened, carrying a weight of certainty and purpose. I am committing an initial investment of $1 million to help you establish your nonprofit organization. For a brief moment, the cabin was still, as though the announcement was too monumental to immediately comprehend. Then, applause erupted, filling the cabin with thunderous approval. Passengers who had witnessed Ezra's actions now smiled at him with admiration and respect. A woman seated nearby leaned toward her companion, whispering, "He deserves this." An elderly passenger bowed his head in prayer, his lips moving in silent gratitude. Ezra remained seated, stunned. His hands trembled slightly, his heart pounding as if trying to match the enormity of the moment. Tears glistened in his eyes, catching the golden rays of dawn streaming through the windows. I don't know what to say," Ezra stammered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Thank you for believing in me." Nathaniel stepped closer, placing a firm yet gentle hand on Ezra's shoulder, his eyes radiating encouragement. "You've earned this, Ezra." Nathaniel turned to address the rest of the cabin, his gaze steady, ensuring his words reached every soul present. "Sometimes," Nathaniel began, his voice deliberate and resonant, "all the world needs is one person willing to stand up and change it." His words echoed in the cabin, a poignant reminder that transformation often begins with the smallest yet bravest acts. The passengers sat in thoughtful silence, nodding in quiet agreement. They realized they had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment that would not only alter Ezra's life but challenge the way they each viewed their own. Morning light streamed through the window, casting its gentle glow on Ezra's face, a man now ready to step into the next chapter of his life. The sky outside gradually brightened, the golden rays of a new day chasing away the lingering shadows of stormy clouds. Flight AA-1701 glided gracefully across the runway, leaving behind the trials and fears that had gripped everyone on board. But within the hearts of each passenger, something had shifted. "Nathaniel, this is only the beginning, Ezra. Turn your dream into reality, not just for yourself, but for your community." Ezra allowed a small, determined smile to cross his lips. His eyes sparkled with newfound hope and resolve. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. Challenges would persist, obstacles would arise. But now, he carried with him the most powerful tool of all, the belief in his own ability to make a difference. The plane came to a full stop. One by one, passengers gathered their belongings and stepped off the aircraft, their hearts filled with fresh perspectives and stories to share. Ezra followed, walking into the embrace of the morning light. Ezra, thinking, this is the beginning of a new journey, a journey of hope and change. And so, what had started as a flight seemingly bound for disaster became the dawn of something greater. It was a journey that transformed lives, not only Ezra Langston's, but also those of everyone who had been there to witness his rise. The bus rolled slowly into the station, leaving a faint cloud of dust on Detroit's worn streets. The lingering chill in the air carried the final snowflakes of the season, fluttering gently to the ground. Ezra Langston stepped off the bus, pulling a battered suitcase behind him. He paused on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath as his eyes scanned the familiar streets he had known all his life. Detroit unfolded before him, its weathered neighborhoods, faded buildings, and walls scarred with graffiti. Once a beacon of hope, the city had long become a symbol of broken dreams. Yet today, in Ezra's eyes, the city shimmered with newfound hope. He dragged his suitcase through narrow alleys where he once played as a child. The children in the neighborhood eyed him curiously, while adults watched from their porches, quietly noting the man who had returned after a long and arduous journey. When Ezra stopped in front of an old building, he stood still for a moment. It was the building he had rented to house his organization, New Horizon. He gazed up at the small sign hanging above the entrance. The words, "New Horizon, a new beginning for our community," swayed gently in the breeze. Ezra's eyes shone with determination and resolve. Ezra, internal monologue. This isn't just an organization. This is hope reborn for the forgotten children. This is where they'll find opportunities they never thought possible. He stepped forward, pulling a key from his pocket. The old door creaked open, revealing a path to something greater. In a modest apartment in Detroit's South Side, Selena Langston sat on a worn sofa, wrapped in a thin blanket. Her health had deteriorated after rounds of treatment, but her eyes still sparkled with unwavering hope. The small apartment was humble, yet filled with warmth. On the table sat a steaming cup of tea and a stack of unpaid bills. Selena paid no mind to them, her focus entirely on the television screen in front of her. The morning news was airing a special segment. Reporter, voiceover. Today in Detroit, a new organization called New Horizon has been established, aiming to provide educational and developmental opportunities for children of color. The screen shifted to Ezra Langston, standing confidently outside the headquarters of New Horizon. His face radiated a blend of confidence and unshakable determination. Selena closed her eyes briefly, a gentle smile spreading across her lips. Ezra, on the broadcast, speaking with conviction. We believe every child deserves the chance to rise. New Horizon is not just an organization. It's a promise that no one will be left behind. When Selena opened her eyes, they glistened with tears. The reporter continued. This is the dream of Ezra Langston, a former factory worker who has now become the founder of an organization poised to transform Detroit's future. Selena placed a hand over her heart, feeling its strong, steady rhythm, a reflection of her pride and love. She knew that all the struggles they had endured were now justified. Selena couldn't take her eyes off the screen, where Ezra's image lingered. This was the man she had always believed in, the man who had promised her a better life for them both. Selena, whispering, voice trembling. He did it. A smile, full of happiness and relief, graced her face. Selena smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. She knew that their shared dream, a brighter future for the community, had finally come true. The screen shifted to interviews with local residents. A young mother. New Horizon will give hope to our children. We're so grateful for what Ezra Langston is doing for our community. A young boy. I want to be a doctor. Now, I believe I can. Selena leaned back in her chair, her heart overflowing with emotion. Selena, internal monologue. You kept your promise, Ezra. You've brought us a new future. The morning sunlight gently filtered through the windows of the old building, now transformed into the headquarters of New Horizon. In a small classroom, the light illuminated the innocent faces of children seated neatly on worn wooden chairs. These were children from Detroit's poorest neighborhoods, children who had faced violence, poverty, and neglect. But today, their eyes held something different, hope. Ezra Langston stood at the front of the room, his stance firm and resolute as his gaze swept over the young faces before him. In this space, there was no fear, no doubt. Here, there was only faith in a better future. Ezra smiled, his eyes glowing with warmth and determination. You know, Ezra began, his voice steady yet powerful. We can't choose where we're born. The children's eyes remained fixed on him, each word sinking deeply into their hearts. But we can choose how we live and how we treat others. Some of the children nodded, their small hands clasped together as if holding on tightly to his words. Never let anyone tell you that you don't matter. Ezra walked toward the window, the sunlight casting a golden glow across his face, filling the room with an almost ethereal warmth. You are the future of Detroit. You are the hope of this community. And our mission is to fight for that future. For a moment, the room fell silent. The children continued to watch Ezra, as if seeing, for the first time, someone willing to stand up and fight for them. A young boy sitting in the front row hesitated before raising his hand. "What can we do to change the world, Mr. Ezra?" Ezra's smile softened. He stepped closer to the boy, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. His voice grew softer, yet no less resolute. "Start with the smallest things." He looked around the classroom, his gaze unwavering, filled with purpose. Help others. Stand up when you see injustice. And most importantly, never give up hope. His words were like a spark, igniting a small flame within each child's heart. Outside the New Horizon building, the sunlight shone brightly on the modest sign hanging by the door. New Horizon, a new beginning for our community. The sign glimmered under the sun, a quiet reminder that any dream can come true, if only we are brave enough to begin. Inside the classroom, Ezra stood tall before the children, his eyes shining with belief and aspiration. "Ezra, final word. We will build a new future for Detroit, for our community, and for every child who's ever been forgotten. Because sometimes all the world needs is one person willing to stand up and change it." Asterisk, asterisk. Through the window, the sunlight spilled across the city of Detroit. The worn streets seemed to glow under the morning sun, a symbol of renewal and a future brimming with hope. Anyone can change the world, as long as they have the courage to begin. The story closes, but the journey of Ezra Langston and the New Horizon organization has only just begun. Because change, no matter how small, always starts with the simplest of acts. What do you think about Ezra's journey? If you want to explore more inspirational stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below. Your support helps spread these powerful messages.